Governor McDonnell, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so honored to have you with us today. We'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the 10th Amendment, and then we'll go to questions.
Well, thank you, Kathy, for your work on Constituting America and hosting it on a regular basis to educate people about this incredible, marvelous document, the United States Constitution, now 232 years young as of this Friday. And Janine, thank you for your leadership, co-chairing the organization, everything you've done over the years, all your articles about the Federalist Papers, your acting for just everything. And by the way, happy birthday from last week. So I'm glad to be on, glad to be on with everybody. You know, I'm so glad you picked this because for governors, and I will say in both political parties, we really love the 10th Amendment because it's really what gives the basis of power and authority and jurisdiction for those elected leaders closest to the people, the 50 state governors. And I think it's always good to go back and look at the text of that. I think it's going to come up on the screen. You know, this principle in the 10th Amendment that all the powers that are not expressly given in the Constitution are reserved to the states respectively and to the people. It was so common sense and such a given at the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 that there was a real debate about whether it was even needed. It was surplusage. Hamilton said, well, it's so expressed what we've given to the three different branches of government in Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 of the Constitution. We don't even really need that. But of course, people like from my state, like Patrick Henry and others, wouldn't even sign the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. And so that deal came 4 years later after the ratification of the Constitution in 1788, and then ultimately December 15th, 1791, we get the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are magnificent. The first 8 are all protecting individual liberties from speech to various criminal justice matters of the individual people. And then the 9th and 10th are the structure of government protections that essentially say, if we, the states, have not granted this authority to the federal government, and of course, the states are the ones that ratified this document back in June of 1788. If we don't give that power to the federal government, then you don't have it. And that reservoir of power, as the 10th Amendment says, keeps all the rest of those residual powers in the states. And of course, I'm very grateful to George Mason and James Madison, 2 great Virginians that understood that. In fact, those roots go back really to the Virginia Declaration of Rights written by George Mason back in 1776. It just took 15 years or so to get into the Bill of Rights. The beauty that our founders had, I think, Kathy, in this area is, after our war of independence, people didn't trust King George. You know, all power was pretty much reserved to one person, and that didn't work out well. Led to tyranny. And so nobody really believed that women could actually govern themselves, except for our founders looking at what Locke and Montesquieu and others had written on the separation of powers. They dared to write this incredible political document that's provided more freedom, more opportunity, more prosperity for people than any other document ever written. But they came up with this brilliant idea, of course, based on Montesquieu, the separation of powers vertically between an executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Those are outlined in the first 3 chapters of the Constitution. But secondly, it was this idea of a vertical separation of powers between the federal government, the state government, and then the local governments. And those are the powers that the states were to give the local government. But the states are the ones that really started with the power prior to the Constitution. It's based on these marvelous principles. One is the principle of subsidiarity that's well known in the faith traditions, as you push the power and decision-making as close to the people as you can. And then these maxims of Jefferson: the government closest to the people, governs best. And many have said, the states are the laboratories of democracy and innovation, not having somebody in Washington, D.C. make decisions for New Jersey or Maine or Arizona, California, and have a one-size-fits-all solution. It makes perfect sense. And that was the brilliance of our founders. They just didn't trust strong central government, of course, based on their knowledge of the nature of man, but also, more importantly, their problems with King George. So here's where we are, I think, today. Article 1, Section 8 spells out 17 powers that Congress can do. No more, no less. Do that well. And the president, of course, can only enforce federal laws, which they sometimes, like on immigration, don't do that well. I think starting in probably 1935 or so with the New Deal, our courts got very permissive and very broadly expanding all those federal powers and trampling on some of the rights and abilities of the states to govern themselves. Like from 1935 to 1995, 60 years, not one federal law was ever stricken based on the Commerce Clause. And that and the General Welfare Clause are probably the two most broadly abused, powers of the Congress. That's why you get like the Wickard v. Filburn case in the 40s, where it becomes the federal government has authority over poor farmer Wickard being able to grow crops in his backyard, which is just kind of a nutty decision. But I think recently cases like the Pritz versus U.S. Case, Justice Scalia, of course, a very strong constructionist and constitutionalist, basically struck down part of the Brady handgun law by saying the federal government had overreached on its powers to put that act in place. More recently, the Dobbs decision just last year returned the power of on the right to life and other matters like that back to the states. And again, before 1966, I think, or 68, with the Griswold case, Griswold versus Connecticut, for the first 170 years of the Constitution, that's what everybody thought. The police powers, in other words, laws dealing with the health, safety, welfare, and morals of the people, all those laws were always within the reservoir of the states, not the federal government. And so I'd look at some of these recent cases that really are starting to stand a little more strongly for the 10th Amendment, are really a return to what the courts always thought and what the founders thought for all those these many years. So I think even cases like the Obamacare case, even though it was upheld on the tax and spend clause, Justice Roberts was very clear to say, I'm not upholding this law based on the Commerce Clause. That would be an abuse under the 10th Amendment. So where are we today overall? I still think we're in a precarious position, and I'll give you one fact: $34 trillion of national debt. Now, a lot of that is both political parties, both presidents in both parties are responsible for that. Since George Bush took office 22 years ago, we've gone from 5 trillion to 34 trillion, which is really a national disgrace and a moral burden on our young people that we've put in place. But so much of that, Kathy, I think is based on the federal government doing things that it should not do in education, in commerce, in so many areas. But then, like on immigration, they don't do what they're supposed to do, that they have a duty to do, which is secure our borders. They ignore that, but they are plenty willing through regulation and statutes to take over the education system. Do you remember 1982, Kathy? Ronald Reagan actually zeroed out the Department of Education out of the federal budget, not because he didn't like kids, but because he said, hey, I've read the Constitution. There's nothing in here that has any responsibility for education. That's a job of the states and the local to do. And he's absolutely right. And so this is what's happening today, and I'll close on this, is whether by federal statute or regulation, or by this carrot and stick approach, where you essentially incentivize states to give up their sovereignty to the federal government in exchange for massive amounts of money. We've seen a lot of that. So much power now seems to go to Washington with the one size fits all, and it just violates these fundamental tenets. And we're getting more control from Washington. We're getting more programs going to Washington. They take their cut. They set up a bureaucracy and send a residual amount of that to the states. And here we are, $34 trillion in debt. So I think there's a great time. I think this is an existential problem for America. We got to get this federal structure right, return the power base to where it ought to be, and we'll be a much healthier nation.
Well, thank you, Governor McDonnell. That was a great overview, and really appreciate your insights on the 10th Amendment. And I'm going to go ahead and go to Janine.
Yes, I echo Kathy's sentiments, Governor McDonnell. That was very clear and cohesive and passionate and worrisome in some areas. I really like what you said about one size fits all. I've given hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of speeches to students in the classroom, and yesterday there were five classes, and I kept talking about the fact that House of Representatives, you have your representative in your neighborhood, because you're going to want something different in maybe wherever you are in Colorado than they're going to want Seattle or Miami or
Exactly.
Maine or wherever you may be. And it's because we're a diverse people, and not everybody wants the same thing, and yet the government does seem to do this one size fits all. I really like the way I'll always remember that. I think that's a great way of putting it. But you mentioned something twice that's really on my heart. It's a modern topic, and it's in regard to immigration.
Mhm.
Daily, it's just, oh my God, am I going to turn on the news and watch my 1 hour or 2 hour of news and hear about the hundreds of thousands of people that are continuing to pour over the border, many of them getting away, that are on the terrorist watch list and whatnot. And I keep thinking, well, look, I understand the federal structure, that you have to have a uniformity to immigration, but something's not working here. And how I wish the states had more power at this time. And it's really bothering me. I'm calling my local representatives, saying I keep hearing about the problem, but I'm not hearing about how you're going to fix it. And of course, everybody just thinks their hands are tied with the federal government. And this is one area where I wonder, if we need to restructure it somehow.
Well, you raise a really good question. This has been around, this discussion, since what I think 1987. President Reagan actually had a modest grant of amnesty, but in exchange for more border security and a clearer path towards naturalization. And of course, the only thing that really happened out of that was the actual amnesty. The other parts, here we are 30 some years later, still trying to figure that out. I think border state governors, Janine, would agree with you. When you see what's happened recently with this flood of illegals, as much as 10 million across the borders since this president has been in office, is an incredible burden on our border states. Now, a lot of them, guess what? They happen to be conservative governors in place. And I don't know. I don't know if this is two senators to say, but maybe they would prefer to have all the problems rest on these Republican governors down there, and they can look, the liberals in Washington can look good by saying, well, we're for amnesty, and we're for this, but the burden all goes to people in Texas and Arizona and Louisiana and Florida, places like that, which you see the frustration of a governor like Greg Abbott in Texas sending people to New York and California and other places. And of course, he correctly exposed the hypocrisy when they say, well, we didn't mean here, and so I think everybody, all your viewers and listeners, are familiar with that. I think this is the one I said is the federalism problem in reverse. I mean, looking at the Article 1 and Article 2, especially Article 2 under the Article 1 of the Congress power, all these things dealing with a system of naturalization and so forth, this is all the exclusive province of the federal government. And they're not doing it. And so that you create this reverse problem, putting all the burden on the states, and they've got the powers then within the states to deal with crime and other things like that. But the practical point is, well, it's too late. You've already let all these people in, including people that are potential terrorists, that are criminals. About 3% on average is what's estimated. And then you've got all of the drug dealers that are coming across. Fentanyl as a crisis, and the federal government turns a blind eye. So I don't know. It sure would be nice if the federal government decides they don't want to do it, then to give some powers to the state government. But I just think you need to have a chief executive that will actually enforce the laws of the United States and police the borders. And we'll have a choice.
Yes, but see the sorry to interrupt. I didn't mean to interrupt. The problem seems to be though that and this could be, for Republican, Democrat, it's not a party issue, but if you get a president in office for 4 years or 8 years, that's a long span of a problem that's not getting rectified. And of course, I'm in Texas, and I just think the states need more power here. I'm like, this may be one area where our founders got it wrong, and I'm like the biggest founding fathers cheerleaders in the world. But if the federal government is not going to take care of the problem, and you call your representatives and you go to the state, they say, well, our hands are tied, we can't do anything. It's just maddening. And it doesn't mean people shouldn't migrate here or immigrate here or come in. It's none of that. It's none of the stuff that plays on the heartstrings. It's just the logistics of it. And the kind of and I just feel the states, I don't like this situation where there seems to be nothing in our structure of government to fix it. It's like, okay, you've got all these amendments that the president suddenly doesn't, isn't healthy enough to govern. You can get rid of him and whatnot. But what if he's just negligent in a certain area? Well, I mean, it's not necessarily a 10th Amendment, but it kind of is a 10th Amendment. It's like, maybe we should do an amendment or something to restructure it. If they won't do it, the states get to do it. Like, what? I'm waiting for someone to come up with an answer, and I'm going to toss it over in just a second. But I'm going to rely on you, Governor McDonnell, to give us. I want to hear a how. I want to hear a how. I don't want to hear I want to hear a how. It's so frustrating.
Well, I think there's going to be some test cases, especially when you got governors like DeSantis and Abbott and others who are saying, you're not helping us. We're having to take matters in our own hands. And as you see, they're starting to do it. I mean, I think the Constitution just says that the Congress has the sole authority to establish a uniform rule on naturalization. And over the years, we've assumed that to mean all things related to immigration. And that's why you've got the INS and all these federal agencies. I think there's going to be some cases where, based on the standard police powers of the states that are their reservoir of powers, that they're going to start taking some action to do things to police their own individual borders and do some things as soon as people that are illegal are in their own states. And, the federal government has the ability under Section 287G of the federal law to grant the enforcement authority to the states. But they won't do it. I tried to get that when I was governor, but I had a Democratic president, a Democratic governor. I couldn't get any cooperation, during that time. So I think the answer is they're going to be bold. I think some of these governors and the Supreme Court will then ultimately decide, this is a favorable court, does the system, the uniform rule of naturalization, mean that the states can't do anything? I think the answer is, I don't think so, Janine. I think there's more power there, and it's just never been tested.
Well, there you go. See, I knew you'd do it. There's a how. I knew you'd be the one that could give us an answer. And you know what? I called my representative recently, and I said, you know what? Just do something. Just do something and let them sue you. Like, let them take you to court. Just do something. And I'm talking about things that would be honorable and above board, but just take some actions for safety for the southern border. And if the federal government doesn't like it, let them take you to court, but do something. And it kind of sounds like that's exactly what may be happening here. So interesting.
Well,
all right, I'm going to pass
it enough to do that, Janine. I thought the fentanyl crisis, when you see all these young people dying from fentanyl overdoses, that would wake people up. I thought, when Eric Adams said, I've got a problem, we have a catastrophe in New York, and he's got a very small number of immigrants compared to Texas, I thought, would that be a wake up? I mean, I hate to say it, but when America wakes up, we wake up when we're under attack. And that's when we actually work together. And I'm just afraid that not only the southern border now, Janine, but you hear the reports now along the Canadian border and people coming across even more unchecked there. It's going to take, some other act within the states for people to finally say enough is enough. And that's terrible to say, but This president is not waking up and won't do it.
Yeah, well, maybe the states will get gutsy and take a few actions. And
Yeah.
that article you were talking about. Okay, well, I'm going to pass to Tova because see, I could chat forever, but I have a time constraint. Good deal. All right, Tova, here you go. Thank you, Governor McDonnell.
Thank you, Janine.
Yeah, thank you, Governor, for being on. So I want to talk a bit about state to state relations because I think as a governor, former governor, you're someone who can speak really well to this. So I think a common criticism of, states' power is that, in our modern world, things are very interconnected and many issues from gun control to immigration enforcement to digital rights kind of transcend state borders. So that would be the argument for more national power. But I'm curious, in the absence of, national action on certain issues, how do states work with each other to deal with issues that might transcend a certain border? And, as a former governor, could you share some examples of interstate collaborations where Virginia's worked with other states to address common issues while also being able to preserve state sovereignty?
Sure. It's a very good question. Because even though there are relatively bright lines, although not completely, about who can do what between the state and federal government. The one caution I wanted to say about something you said at the beginning was, the need for practicality and uniformity and convenience is one of those that's made often by the centrists, not the centrists, but the people, the collectivists, who want to have a one size fits all government because, well, it's easier, it's more practical, and then people only have to lobby one government. That's dangerous because then you, in the pursuit of convenience, you trample on all these powers that were reserved to the states. But some people say that. On the other hand, there are so much voluntary cooperation that goes on. I mean, for instance, there's a national conference on state legislatures. There's ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, national groups of legislators that get together. And you know what, Tova? They talk about best practices, what works in one state. And once you prove the metrics, guess what? A lot of other states adopt it. I can think of everything from no-fault divorce to welfare reform to other type of incentives for economic development, and a long list of things that because it's been proven in one state, it'll be copied by others. And that's the states are the laboratories of democracy, free to choose, free to put their principles in place, and then see, does it really work in practice? If it is, people use it. If it doesn't, other states aren't going to do it. So that's one way. We have a national Governors Association, a national Republican Governors Association, and Democrat Governors Association. So there's associations like that, Tova, where people voluntarily get together for several days, presenters, ideas exchange, and then best practices come out of that. And that's what's beautiful about this democracy that our founders created. We don't have to be forced by some law or rule to do things. We do it because it's in the best interest of the people that we serve, our constituents, to find things that work. And the same thing is true even with the judiciary. They have judicial conferences all the time where they deal with problems and being able to address access to justice and indigent defendants and so forth. And they come up with solutions there that then the ones that work are right. So, I mean, welfare reform is one of the best ones that I can think of going back to the 90s. Where Virginia and Michigan really were the ones that kind of were at the tip of the spear. John Engler in Michigan, George Allen in Virginia, and they came out with these pretty significant complete retooling of the welfare state that was creating generations of dependency. They came out with laws that passed, and they were so good. In 1996, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich worked together. Clinton signed a bill to reform welfare at the federal level, and then it spread to all the states. So there's just one example of a major reform that was proof tested in the states and spread nationally. And there's a lot of that going on that we don't read about. Unfortunately, bad news is what you see in the paper. You don't actually read about cooperation. It's not as pithy.
Right, that's certainly true. And then apart from the sort of sharing of best practices, sharing of ideas, are there ever, formal agreements between states for collaboration on certain policy issues? And what form does that take, and what are the venues that those are determined at?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And I meant to say that there are various interstate compacts that are initiated maybe in one state or another, and then it looks like a model for, and you see a lot of these in the law enforcement area on how law enforcement agencies are going to work together. You see it in the energy industry sometimes, where people collaborate for mass disasters. In the healthcare space, there are myriad interstate compacts because, again, government, which is the central focus today, is very important. But if you believe Alexis de Tocqueville and others, the greatness of America is not the government. It's free people choosing to work together, choosing to use their God-given natural rights to do things that free people do in the business community, in the churches, in the synagogues. That's really the greatness of our country. And so these interstate compacts is just a great template for that. Most states have some authorizing legislation by their legislatures that permit that, and then these agencies and other people go out there and enter into those. Businesses will do that between one another, and then we have things like amicus briefs when there's matters of great national importance that are pending before the courts. You'll see a group of attorneys general bind together and sign, those that choose to for their states, sign an amicus brief on behalf of their states saying, hey, the people of Virginia believe that this is the position, justices, that you ought to take on this case. So there are myriad other examples, but those are just a few of people voluntarily taking a position for the good of the country.
Thank you for shedding light on that.
Sure.
And then my other question, I wanted to ask, we've talked about the relationship between the national government and the states, but I want to talk about another important power balance, which is, of course, states and cities, and the division of responsibilities between the two. So obviously, cities are not mentioned in the Constitution as being a source of power, but increasingly in today's world, they really are. I just Googled some quick statistics, and 83% of Americans live in cities today, whereas at the founding, less than 4% did. So obviously, cities have taken on a much, much, much more prominent role in the US and abroad. So, and many cities, I would say, are more similar to each other, cities in different states, than they even are to rural areas in the same state. So could you talk a bit about, on the high level, kind of the defense of states being the laboratories of democracy and states being the fundamental unit of the United States when cities have taken on a lot more prominence, and then also kind of practically how that works and how you navigated that as a governor? Big question, but
no, that's a very good question, because you're right. It's only states and the federal government in the Constitution, and you made the seminal point that the states were the initial reservoirs of the power given to it by the people. And so with the Constitution, the states gave certain powers to the federal government. I mentioned the 17 of them in Article 1, Section 8 that the Congress can do and they have authority over. But the states then also divest themselves of certain power to local governments, and that's cities, counties, and towns. And they do it in two ways. There's two theories of it. One is what's called a Dillon rule state like Virginia, and that is that cities can only do those things which a state government expressly or by implied powers gives to them, or a home rule state like Maryland, where it's just the opposite, where we presume that the city can do anything that the state can do unless it's expressly prohibited. But those are the two ways that the powers gets to the local government. So obviously a lot of things that just make practical sense. I mentioned at the top of the show this principle of subsidiarity, and what do people local, closer to the people, what do they do best? Well, maybe it's land use issues, it's zoning, it's waste collection, it's water, sewer, those kinds of things that, Virginia Beach isn't the same as Hampton or Chesapeake or Norfolk. They all have different constituencies, different populations, different types of problems in those cities based on their land mass and their population, et cetera. So That's when you really get down to that granular level. And the reason I love that system is, it's a whole lot easier to find your local city councilman that might only represent 20,000 people as opposed to your U.S. senator that represents, let's say, 8.5 million people in Virginia. They're much more accessible. They're much more able to be found and listen and have more time for you. And, I listened extensively to local government people in figuring out how do we best serve them. And so most of the things regarding, let's say, public education are local governments and, more importantly, local school boards that are elected or appointed to regulate the curriculum and govern the school systems. And that's the way it ought to be. You don't want the capital of the state, or certainly don't want Washington, D.C. telling you what the kids ought to learn in school.
Right. And then just to put it more bluntly, like as a governor, what would you say to someone who comes up to you and says, I think in light of all of this, the primary seat of power should be the local government. They should be the ones developing policy rather than the state government. Oh, the same arguments that national government proponents would make against states. What would you, that, oh, the cities are closer to the people, that sort of thing. What would you say to that? Defend your job.
Well, I think this comes down because it's generally not, it may be a matter of state constitution that actually sets in place what the states have. And then there's a whole section in a lot of constitutions that spells out what local governments can have as a general rule. Statutes to say generally local governments can do this. And then each city can actually make an application for more power through what they call the charter. Each city or county or town has their individual charter. And so a big city like Virginia Beach may have a lot more power to do things on a broader scale or even a regional scale with multiple cities on a cooperative compact, like for water and sewer. We have a regional authority. So it really comes down to between state and local government. What's the controlling constitutional provision or statute? And more importantly, what works? Because whatever works, state governments usually are smart enough to give the authority to that city to do what's best for them and their constituents.
Well, thank you so much for being on and for sharing your many years of expertise in state government. And I'll now pass on to Jewel and Jordan for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for everything you have given us so far, imparting some of your knowledge on us. I'm very curious about where is it really said in the Constitution, and if you could just give a deeper answer, because you touched on it earlier, about federal government having jurisdiction over the border and immigrants, and where it is so clear that states, that is obviously not up to states as we've learned, but could you just really explain that? Because that is, I never really thought about immigration being in the Constitution as a federal power. And when you just think of it plainly, you would imagine it should be up to states. But could you just really explain that for us?
So here's the place that I would say, Article 1, Section 8, under the 17 authorities of Congress, it says, number 3, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. So naturalization obviously is the process for becoming a citizen of the United States if you're not naturally born. If you're naturally born, you automatically become a citizen at birth. So that's the one that gives this broad authority. But the question then becomes, well, what's naturalization? Does that start when somebody's coming across the border and they're illegally present in the United States? I mean, the determination of who is a citizen of the United States is a federal question. There's some references to immigration and also in Section 9 about the migration or importation of purposes into the country. But I think what I was trying to say a little bit earlier is that there's there's, I think, some questions as to where does the federal authority end under that system of naturalization, and where does the state government authority begin? And I think when it comes to crimes committed by persons in a state, that seems to me to begin as soon as they set foot on your soil. And so I think there's some unresolved conflicts about what the state authority might be, and which is why I think when you see different governors at the border states that are so frustrated because the Biden-Harris administration will not do its job in securing the border, providing for a strong national defense. That's another one that's relied on for the source of federal power and maintaining an army and so forth. But it seems to me that that there's going to be some test cases, as I said earlier, that'll test where the state authority can begin.
I think it's interesting point. I think it's also interesting with the concept of a state having its own border and that governor feeling responsible for protection of the citizens as people come over that own state's border. I have a two-part question that's answer it however you will. The 9th and the 14th Amendment in the application of the 14th Amendment have sometimes been seemingly in opposition to each other. And I wonder if your viewpoint is that it's in the application of the 14th Amendment over where the federal government's where they've used that part of the 14th Amendment of federal laws to hold over state laws. And it was, of course, because many of our southern states had laws that were disenfranchising and stripping citizens' rights away from blacks and slaves. And it was part of the way of them going to fix that. But then we saw when we got more into the future that was going to be applied differently. Do you think there's some conflict between the way that those two amendments are applied? And then also, do we think that there's some conflict between the administrative organizations like the EPA and even Department of Education and these powers that they're able to have over citizens of the states, that we see powers that were not directly given to the Congress or to the federal government, but are being applied over the entire country and to citizens of states, that those powers would reside in the state governments and not these administrative state organizations or departments.
Yeah, that's Jewel. Is this Jewel or Jorm?
This is Jewel.
Hey, Jewel. Very thoughtful questions. I see why you won that award now. So to your point, I think what you're talking about is the 14th Amendment created this idea of the incorporation doctrine, where the items that were in the Bill of Rights were applied to the states, because it was felt that if you read most of the first eight amendments to the Constitution, the individual liberties, it says Congress shall not, for instance, in the First Amendment, make a law. Well, the 14th Amendment, the corporation doctrine, applied all those laws then to the states, like the Equal Protection Clause, which is in the Fifth Amendment. And then you mentioned the conflict with the 9th Amendment, which is not completely unlike the 10th, but basically reserves all the rights that aren't previously delegated, to the government, that are retained by the people. So I think, here after 232 years since that Bill of Rights has been approved, there's still some areas of what you could say is the overlap or conflict of power. I call the 9th and 10th Amendments sort of the forgotten amendments. They've not been probably applied nearly as much or interpreted or litigated nearly as much as the other 8 amendments of the Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment. So I think there's probably still room for that conflict when there are laws that seem to obviate those retained powers of the people or the states, respectively, in the 9th and 10th Amendment, where a construction under the 14th Amendment may very well be in conflict. And then the question is, well, which one is supreme? I'm glad to say that at least with people like Justice Scalia and Alito and others on the bench that understand that and understand the federal structure of America and why it's so fundamentally important and why it was completely unanticipated that anybody would ever think that Congress could do more than what's in Article 1, Section 8. And yet they found ways, especially under the General Welfare Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, to expand those powers well beyond their breaking point. So there's more room where you can see that happening. I think in some agencies, as you mentioned, like the Department of Education, DOE, and the EPA, ones that I wonder whether our founders would have even begun to say were proper. As I mentioned, Reagan tried to get rid of DOE over 40 years ago. That's been those things have been rejected, I think, really under the necessary and proper, or even more the general welfare clause. Education is necessary for the general welfare. That gets what did the general welfare clause really mean? So there's still room to go on that. And the last thing I'd say is over time, the beauty of the United States Constitution, which by the way, is the model for so many other countries when they're figuring out how to do democracy. You know, when the Iron Curtain collapsed, when revolutions end in other continents, so many of them come to the United States and say, show us your Constitution, explain us to us so we know how to do democracy better. We're the oldest existing democracy in the world right now. And so this is the place where we do it better than anybody else. And one of the things we do is occasionally the Supreme Court gets it not just wrong, but horrifically wrong. You think of Dred Scott back in the 1850s, took 3 constitutional amendments to overrule that. Roe v. Wade, that was a law for 50 years, now under the principles of federalism returned to the states. The Kelo versus City of New London case, it sort of trampled on property rights of individuals, kind of contorted Mr. Mason's view of property rights under the Fifth Amendment. That now has been almost completely overdone by state law and state constitution. So we've got a mechanism, Jewel, to get it right when we make mistakes.
That's awesome. Just really quick, before we pass to I know there's a lot of great audience questions. As a governor, we've heard of departments like the Department of Education, let's say, saying have these, we hear it broadly talked about, but we don't know really what is meant exactly. Say, Department of Education, have these standards, and then you get this money, or we'll fund whatever. Could you tell us, is that how some things happen? Do you think there's an issue with the federal government doing that?
There's been actually that's the carrot and stick approach, Jewel, I was talking about earlier, where they don't directly mandate it because they know that would probably be stricken under the federalist structure. But they basically say, okay, well, we're going to give you money and you can take it voluntarily. And if you take it, then it comes with these strings attached. How many times have you heard that saying? The federal money comes with strings attached. It's basically an incentive, or worse, to force the states to do some things. And they know if you don't take the money, there's going to be some major constituency in your state that's going to oppose you, harass you, or urge you to take the money because it's going to go for some good cause. But good causes don't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do by the federal government. And so that's the way they're doing it more often than not is with those. No Child Left Behind, which was actually a Republican initiative under President Bush, I think pushed that. It was one of those types of things that kind of mandated in exchange for significant amounts of money that you adopt a standard set of academic standards for your entire school system. And we opted out of it. I mean, we didn't take the last tranche of the money because we already had very high standards of education in Virginia, and it was going well, and we were doing well on all the standardized tests. So it was tough, but we told them, we're not taking that money and having to change our whole standards of education to meet what some national bureaucratic one-size-fits-all group said that we should do. for the nation. And I think that was the right decision for Virginia. I think a few other states did the same. But this is the kind of choice that a governor's got to make, or the legislature has to make, to do what's right for them. And by the way, the last thing I want to say on this federalism issue is almost every state in the country has something that approaches a balanced budget amendment, some way of reining in spending, and more importantly, reining in debt. I think even California, the federal government's got nothing like that. They print money. They do continuing resolutions. We haven't balanced the budget since the Gingrich-Clinton years, which was now 25 years or so ago. But states have to do it. I mean, governors of both parties are sort of shocked by the way the federal government runs itself, and that we're 34 trillion in debt, because they don't have to balance the budget. We can go into deficit spending for a generation, which is where we are now. And that's why, again, the states generally have it right when it comes to things like fiscal responsibility, and the federal government is, largely out of control.
Thank you so much. We've got a bunch of audience questions, I believe.
Yes, and thank you everyone for all your great questions. It's been a wonderful discussion. We want to take a moment and recognize our students and teachers who are on with us today. Christine Del Rio has students from the Rocky Mountain Academy. Elise Rivas is homeschooled in high school and listening with her mom, Hope Mucklow. D'Angela Hines has students from Emerald Coast Christian Academy, and Cami Wanouse is a homeschool student watching. And if you're a student or a teacher and we didn't give you a shout out, just write us a little message in the Q&A queue, and we'll try to do that before the program's over. We also want to thank our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. These podcasts are played at 6 p.m. on Mondays on Las Vegas's KKVV. So thank you to our listeners in Las Vegas. Governor McDonnell, Dal Andrew asked an interesting question about Tennessee passing a nullification bill. That there's a bill right now, I believe in Tennessee, under consideration, that if the state of Tennessee deemed a federal regulation or even law unconstitutional, the state would have the power to nullify it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, good luck. I mean, I think a lot of those decisions will probably head to court, and the courts will decide did or did not the federal government have the authority to do that. And it'll be the same constitutional analysis, Kathy, that we've discussed before. Is there bona fide authority within Article 1, Section 8 for the federal government to pass that law, and ultimately for the executive branch to put the regulations in place to enforce that law? And if that'll be the question. It is interesting, though, that they would give that authority, I guess, either to the legislature or the people to make that decision on behalf of the state. Normally, you have a state attorney general that would make that determination, and if they felt that it was improper, they'd file the appropriate actions in their local federal court to challenge the statute. Sometimes with a number of other states, as I mentioned, with these amicus briefs or joint sign-on letters opposing a federal enactment. But this is another way of doing, in a way, what's going on now through attorney generals and governors. And Tennessee is a volunteer state. Tennessee and Florida and Texas, and used to be Virginia in that category, were kind of the ones at the vanguard of pushing back against the federal government for overreach.
Well, thank you. And that actually leads to our next question. Tracy asks if you could give us an example or two, either from your time as Attorney General or your time as governor, where Virginia did push back on an issue and you utilized the 10th Amendment as your reason for objection.
Well, I mentioned the education one, which is probably the best one that I can remember during my time on the No Child Left Behind. And I also mentioned we're trying to avail ourselves because of the immigration laws. We had not like a border. Well, we are a border state. We're a border with the water, but we're also a border with Washington, D.C. And so many people were coming into Northern Virginia. And, I petitioned the governor, Senator Kane, then Governor Kane, and asked him to join with me in asking the federal government to give us the authority to enforce immigration laws. which it can do under Section 287G of the Immigration Code. And of course, I didn't get anywhere with that. We did not get the approval because I just didn't have the requisite support. But those are the ones that come to mind right away.
Well, thank you. And then Robert Zimmerman asks, we've been talking quite a bit about Department of Education today, and Robert asked, what is the purpose of the Department of Education? And as governor, it's certainly not your job to speak for the U.S. Department of Education, but
well, Kathy, on its surface, it sounds great. It's mom and apple pie, and that's how a lot of federal programs get done without asking the question: is it the province of the federal government? Does it make any sense? Do the states do it better? Very few people, frankly, in either political party ask those questions the way they should today. And when the DOE was stood up, and I can't remember when, maybe the 50s or 60s, it was one more way of saying, hey, we and the Congress, we think education is critically important for the future of the nation. And so we want to play a role in this. And it is. It's absolutely vital to pass on the role of morality and civics and patriotism, et cetera, to the next generation. It's just the wrong area of government that leads to this massive bureaucracy, massive administrative state, and power grab and rule setting at the wrong level of government. It's not the one closest to the people. Virginians have a very different idea, maybe, of what the kids should learn than, let's say, Washington State or Oregon or California. There's a different value set here. So why should we have these centrists from centralists, if you will, from around the country telling Virginia what to do with its schools, when our Constitution says that control of the local schools belongs to the local school board? So there's any number of problems with the jurisdiction of the minds of our children residing in Washington, D.C. But the biggest one is it's just not one that I don't think was ever contemplated by our founders.
Well, thank you. And we're right at the top of the hour. We just appreciate so much you being with us today. And we want to remind our listeners that we are going to be back on January 9th with our next Constitutional Chats podcast, and wish all of our listeners a very happy Hanukkah and Merry Christmas. And we just are so grateful to all of our listeners who are with us today. And Governor McDonnell, would you have any closing words? And also, I'll just throw it open to our panel to see if there's any closing comments.
Those marvelous,
I just want to say
those
thank
marvelous
you, Governor
words that were
sorry.
crafted by our founders in 1787 and then amended in 1791 are the ones that have breathed more freedom and prosperity and generosity than has ever been created by a political document. And if we tread on changes, at our own peril. It's only been amended 27 times. We've come an awful long way towards that goal of becoming a more perfect union. And the beauty of the states, of course, is if you don't like what's going on in one state, you've got the freedom of mobility. Move to a place where the laws are more suited to your values and your view of the American dream. And I'll invite everybody to come to Virginia.
Well, thank you. And Janine, did you?
Virginia's a beautiful. Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Governor McDonnell. And of course, I'm a Texan, but I've driven through Virginia so many times on the way to New York City. And it is a beautiful state. And it was lucky to have you as a governor. So thank you so much for gracing us with your intellect and perspectives today.
Yeah, blessed to be on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you.